So you up next?
No, I got one more after this.
One more after this.
I don't go till 5:20. Right before the party. Or 5:40 actually.
Well, that's perfect. Woo. There we go. Then we can all have a beer while we watch your talk.
That would be great if they served beer right before the last stuff.
Yeah, beer and Angular testing. That sounds fun to me.
That's the right way to get through testing.
Is that one of your summary points?
Should put that in the slides. Next version of Ionic is going to have to change it to and any framework you want.
I did today, yeah. Pretty much how it rolls, huh? It's fun. It was really fun putting this. I went and reviewed everything. And you're like, so this is how I did do it. This is how we can do it. And that's how we will do it for almost everything in here because it's such a dynamic space at the moment. But it's fun. It's cool. Yeah. Did you see anything good today? What was the best thing?
I really like that. Going to the opinionated ASP.
Oh, by Scott. He's awesome.
I watched a lot of this stuff about moral stuff.
Me too. Yeah, it's cool. Yeah. So was he very opinionated?
Yeah, it was pretty decent.
Did he say not to do stuff? Yeah? I haven't seen that one yet. So what was he against?
A lot of structures.
Like by feature? Yeah. Is that what you're doing?
That's what we're currently doing.
You do by feature or by? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I really like the new .NET stuff. Last year's been really cool. Yeah. It's all slides, but I'm going to show you some code. No, you're not going to see me live code today. Yeah. Today's a lot about the story of what are your choices, because this landscape's really changing. So I'll show you what I have been doing, and I'll show you how to do it, and I'll show you some choices. But really, I'm not going to bore you with code for the whole session saying, this is how you do step by step. I've got some play-by-plays, I'll point you to them. You can just watch a better production version of that if you want. Yeah. Hmm? Yeah, that could be good. It's quite a dark kit.
So we can get
That'd be good.
contrast for you.
Perfect. Cool. Give it a few more minutes. How you doing? Good to start? All right, great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session on talking about Ionic and NgRx and Angular. And we're going to be talking all about building web and mobile applications and trying to share as much code as possible. I'm pretty excited to hear talk about this. I've given this talk before, and I've kind of been in this space now for the last year and a half, and it's changing. But it's a really fun space to be in. It's kind of what I've had a chance to do a whole bunch of. So today, someone in the audience quickly asked, oh, you're going to be doing a lot of live coding. I'm not going to be doing any live coding during this. I'm going to show you lots of code. But really what I'm going to be talking about is like where have we been and where are we at and where are we going and what are all the choices you have for sharing code in this specific space. So my name's Duncan. I'm a software architect from Australia. I live in Sydney. And I'm pretty lucky for the last 4 years or so to work for a consulting company where I pretty much just did Angular. That's all I've done. And I'd spend half my time on client sites and writing code and committing code, and I might kick them off, or I might be a serial committer to their project, or I might just come in to do a code review. But I'd probably work on about 12 different Angular teams a year, all committing code, and then the other half of the time I've been really lucky to fly around running training events, be it Pluralsight or workshops like I ran for the 2 days here. And what's really cool about doing lots of Angular and lots of just one thing is you make lots of mistakes and you learn from them, but you also get to see all the different things that other people are doing. I've always come over for NG which was on in Utah recently, which is the main conference 2 weeks ago. And you kind of get a feel for where everyone's going and what's happening. And hopefully I can share some of that stuff today, especially around sharing code, because that space is changing a fair bit. So this is kind of the situation that we're going to be talking about. You have a web app here that you've written all this code for, and then you need to have a mobile app that's pretty much the same thing, but you need to share that code. Who's ever been in this experience that they've written a web app and now they have a report and it's like, okay, you want to put almost the same code into a mobile app. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So, but in particular, talking about if you have an Ionic and an Angular app, and how do you share code between these two things? So I've had the chance to go do this for a couple of customers last year. worked with a university where they wanted to have these series of mobile apps for doing navigation around the campus, and then also have some of that on a web app. And went and helped this school chain back in Brisbane, one of the states back home, where they wanted to do a similar thing. It was mostly a mobile app, but they want to have a web version. And then again, for this investment company, you already had the web app, and then they want to go to the mobile app. And what I've done with these people most of the time is NPM packages, which is one of the things I'll talk about. But since leaving this other company I worked for and doing all this consulting, I'm now working on another product that I own, a company called FoodZone. Now I'm in the same position where I've got to have a mobile and a web app. But the difference is now I have to pull the dollars out of my own pocket and put my money behind that decision. And I'm using the same tools because I really love them. So it's a position that I find myself in, and I've had the chance to do a fair bit of. So we'll be sharing that today. And as I mentioned, this is the way I've been mostly doing it. I'd have an NPM package, and I'd put that shared code in between the web and the mobile, because there's often a lot in these kind of business line of application style things that are similar between the two. So I'd be sticking them in an NPM package. But while I was doing all these NPM packages, I started to see kind of a shift in a certain way people are doing things. And I started to see people talking about monorepos. So this is a blog from Alex Eagle on the Angular team, and he's like, you'll love monorepos too, and I'm starting to get more interested about it. So monorepo being the idea that you might have multiple Angular applications in one repository. And then I see some of the most popular podcasts. So you've got like Angular Adventures in Angular and Angular Air, talking about this monorepo approach versus a many repo approach and the pros and cons. And all this time I'm writing all these NPM packages for these other customers. And then I also find it really interesting to hear that like Google and Facebook also use a monorepo, which is pretty fascinating. If you're an Angular developer on the Angular team and you change something, it gets committed to master. Every single Angular application at Google will instantly get that same version of that code. So it's hard to argue that a monorepo won't work, but I guess where this is leading is I'm kind of hearing all about these monorepos, getting interested, trying to solve sharing code at work. And then this tool comes along called Narwhal Extensions for Angular, or NX. So this is a way of doing a monorepo with Angular, specifically for Angular. So all of this is happening. I'm getting more interested in it over time. And that's kind of led me to the point now where I'm like, well, there's kind of two approaches. You could either use NPM packages, or you could kind of have a monorepo. And rather than getting that shared code between mobile and web into a package that you NPM install, you could just have it in the repository. So I'm going to be talking mostly about these two approaches and what it looks like to do that. So we'll kick off talking a little bit about the new Angular and Ionic, and there's a fair bit of changes in that space coming. We'll talk about some of the code reuse options you have. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about NgRx and why I think it's one of the most important parts if you're going to get code reuse in your Angular applications, because it's so great for sucking logic out of your components. And then it makes it much easier to share across components, even if they're in different applications. Then I'll talk about that first main option, which is NPM packages, and then talk about the other option, which is NX monorepo, or you could do both. So let's talk about Angular for a little bit. I'm not going to bore you with too much of a background with Angular. Who here has used Angular JS or the new Angular before? Okay, almost a lot of people in the room. So Angular JS is the first version. Everything from Angular 2 or further on, they now just call Angular without the JS. And its goal was to be a super heroic JavaScript framework. But it had kind of problems. It was great. Like, you know, it had a lot of adoption. It solved a lot of our problems, but it was pretty slow when you started to scale with it. And this is where the next version has kind of a very lofty goal. You can see this is straight off their website today, mobile and desktop, one framework. So they're very ambitious at staying in this space of being one framework, mobile and desktop. And I really like Angular for lots of reasons. I guess the biggest reason it's a complete framework. You're going to get component model, dependency injection, routing, testing, internationalization, animation, accessibility, testing twice. And a production build tool. You're going to get lots of things out of the box in one spot. But there's more than that. There's a whole bunch of tools as well in the community that Angular either own or they're a big part of. So you've got Universal for server-side rendering, Angular Elements, which is really exciting. If you haven't seen that, that's in beta now for Angular for being able to do web components, which is kind of part of this code sharing story. So you can write web components with Angular and you could put that on any site. It doesn't have to be an Angular site. You could put it on a React site or just a straight vanilla JavaScript website. There's PWA stuff coming down the pipeline, which is amazing. And now, as of the last version, because we're currently at version 6 this week, we shifted about a week or two ago from 5 to 6, you can just go ng add progressive web app and it will set you up an Angular app as a progressive web app. So there's lots of this robust nature coming into the framework now. There's NgRx, which we'll talk a bunch about for doing state management in Angular applications. There's the Angular CLI, which is like hugely popular and is the main tool for making stuff, and we'll be talking about that. There's Material for doing material components. There's the component dev kit, which is a way of being able to use all the logic from Material, but without having the styling from Material. And then you've got animations and internationalization. Basically, this is one of the big draw cards for me with Angular, is it's this really robust tool chain that you can use, or framework. It's easy to hire people, and it's very enterprisey. So it's kind of, a really appealing offer. And it keeps getting better. I really like this slide. They showed this off at NG Conf 2 weeks ago. So they've had this team goal. The product manager for the team would make them a cake if they got under 10 kilobytes for a hello world. So this is kind of interesting that at the moment, version 6, they're at 36 kilobytes for a hello world, which is pretty impressive from where they've come from. It's getting smaller and smaller all the time. And now, with the new things coming down the pipeline, like the Ivy renderer, which isn't here yet, they're going to have like a minified, then compressed version down to like 2 kilobytes they were showing off. So it's cool. It's constantly changing. It's all constantly kind of pushing the boundaries, which makes stuff tough for us. I'm sure a lot of you have felt kind of the speed of change in this environment is quite fast. And another, kind of an interesting part of this story here is for us as a team, we've traditionally done lots of web development, but as of 2016, it was the first time kind of the statistics show kind of a crossing of paths where most of the code that we write as developers, more of it's going to be used on a mobile or a tablet versus being on a desktop. So no longer could we be like mostly a web shop with a little bit of mobile. We now need to have lots of mobile and lots of web. And I'm sure a lot of you are in a very similar position. What we'd love to have, I'm sure all of us would love to have this, is just native Android and native iOS, but that's pretty expensive, yeah. You have to have 2 teams, then you have to have 2 code bases, and then you have to keep them in sync and the overhead. So for this reason, we're seeing lots of different options for trying to solve this problem, to write one code base for mobile and then just compile down to these 2. Nobody's solving it perfectly yet, and there's a fair few options. On one front, you've got Xamarin, and we've done several Xamarin apps in the company I was at before, but we found it was quite tough. We had to have we couldn't just drop a C# dev straight on a Xamarin team, and they'd be effective straight away. There was a fair bit of ramp up for them, but then the Xamarin stuff would be awesome. But we kind of wasn't working for us. Flutter's a new one. Who's heard of Flutter? Anybody heard of Flutter? Wow, Google's got to promote better. So Flutter is a tool. Oh, one person up the back. Flutter's a tool from Google I/O is on right now. They'll be talking about it. They've been 2 years, I think, or something with Flutter. So it's similar to Xamarin. You write Dart code, which is pretty much a language that comes from Google, and then it will compile down into native code that you can run on Android and iOS. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. They're talking all about it for a fair while now. React Native is another choice. If you're a React shop, then it's a no-brainer. This is a good choice. And I kind of have it a little bit to the right because it's kind of not quite as native as the ones on the left. There's still a little bit of overhead to it. And then there's NativeScript. So NativeScript is mostly Angular-based. Who's used NativeScript here? Okay. Who's used Ionic, by the way? Okay. Maybe a third of the room. So NativeScript is a really good choice. I haven't used it professionally yet. I find it kind of interesting. 6 months ago, I would have said, I don't know if I'd trust using it. I don't know if it's going to go the distance. But now I'm seeing a lot of adoption. I think it's not a bad choice. But on the right here, Ionic is the one that I'll be talking lots about. And I kind of have it on the right here because it's more of the web. They're kind of very web-focused versus being more sort of like compiled down to native code. So what is Ionic for those who haven't used it? Ionic is basically an open source SDK for building mobile apps. And this is changing dramatically right now. So at the moment, it's basically Cordova, which allows you to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then access the phone's abilities like camera and contacts and so forth. So you use your web skills, and in particular, you use your Angular web skills. You write Angular code, and it feels like writing an Angular app, and then it compiles down to go on the device. And this is currently how it works, but this is really changing a lot, and it's really exciting. So what's happening now, Ionic team, I don't know, it's pretty crazy how ambitious I think they're trying to be, but they're writing this replacement called Capacitor for Cordova. So that's the thing that will manage dealing with the device. And they're now saying, framework whatever, you can turn up with Angular, you can turn up with Vue, and you can turn up with Stencil. They've also rewritten all their stuff as Stencil is a web components. It's the Ionic web components. So they've rewritten this like web-based system now, and they're really pushing towards web. And this changes how we can share code because things are getting, they're trying to make this experience where you just write for the web and then it will just work on a mobile. But we're not quite there yet. This is coming down the pipeline. So Ionic 1 was pretty slow. That was one of its biggest problems. Million apps built sort of thing on it. They got huge adoption. And Ionic 3 has been much better for us. It's been much faster. It's written on the new framework, Angular 2, which has been good for us, or Angular 2 or higher. And then Ionic 4 is going to be much, much faster, supposedly. Like all the parts of it have been changed. So that's going to be pretty exciting. But I think the thing that we really like about Ionic is just how easy it is for us to take an Angular developer and get them effective at writing a mobile app so quickly. You basically can come in and say Ionic start, give your project a name, and then you can say what type. I want it to have tabs on the bottom. And then you can just CD into your project and say Ionic serve. You don't need an emulator or run in the browser, and you can just get going really quickly. And if you want to build it and deploy it, then pretty much you just can go Ionic Cordova run Android -- release, and you're away. And they have a whole, there's so much to Ionic. I'm not going to go through all of it. They've got a whole Ionic Pro kit they keep working on so that you can, go from design all the way to, building it online so that you can get the IPK or the APK to actually deploy. And it's quite a robust system coming down. The other thing that I really like, and this is related to sharing code here, is that you end up getting this set of components with Ionic. So, and I really love them because when I first started using them, I was like, wow, these are better than all the other web components I use from Kendo or other people there. They just seem to work. But the problem with these widgets, like a slider and a drop-down that they have at the moment, is they're not designed to run in the browser. They're designed to run on the device. They're optimized for touch and all those sorts of things. So it's very, very rare to see someone try and take these components or widgets and use them on a web app. So you end up in this position where you've got some you use on the mobile app and a whole other set that you use on your web when you're trying to share code. You can do Windows, but I'm not sure what's happening in this space. Very rare. I think Microsoft is the only person I know who's ever deployed an Ionic app with Windows Phone. Once. Okay. So Stencil, I mentioned. Stencil's really exciting. So Stencil, they've got the Stencil compiler. Who's heard of Stencil? Okay, one person, so not many. So there's a whole bunch of stuff you're going to see coming down the pipeline for Ionic across multiple frameworks. It's going to be bigger for Vue and for Angular. So Stencil is a set of web components based on the web component standard. So they don't need to run in a framework. You can drop them on any website and they'll run. They're self-contained, following a standard. So they've gone and replaced, and soon with Ionic 4, all of the widgets that you get from Ionic will run perfect just as well on a web app as they will on a mobile app. So the code sharing story is going to get better. So Stencil's worth looking out for. Whoop. Whoop. Just go back a step there. So Ionic is really interesting to watch. If you're betting on Ionic at the moment and you're building apps with Ionic, they're a person to watch because they're changing dramatically. I kind of watch and go, I hope they pull it off because, I've got all these apps in it and other sorts of things. And this is one of their mottos, target the web wherever it runs. And another one of their mottos is kind of along the lines of like, web first. That's what they're really focused on, where these other people trying to solve this problem of one code base are really trying to go down to a native kind of experience. So it's an interesting approach that they're taking. So that's just a little bit talking about what's coming down and how that kind of affects us a little bit. But I want to jump into talking about like what are your options for code reuse, good and bad. And in particular, when we have an Angular app, we've got components, we've got routing, we've got services, we've got state, these sorts of things that we could share with another application. And in a mobile app, it's pretty similar when you're using Ionic, that is. But what parts of these can we share at the moment? Well, at the moment, it's very easy to share an Angular service because it's just a TypeScript class. It's very easy to share state if you're using NgRx, which we'll get to. But components are a bit trickier because of what I said, like the components with the HTML and the widgets on them. I want to write mine with the best of breed Ionic stuff at the moment for the Ionic, and I want to use Angular material in my web app because they're the best ones for the web stuff, but they don't kind of cross over very well to use on both. So if you've got your own custom ones, then yeah, of course, you can write your own components and then it will work. But for us, what we've been doing is drawing a line there and saying, we're going to share all of the kind of logic on our client side, but our components we're not going to really try and share yet. But in the future, I hope this will be part of where we're heading. So copy and paste, not so good, huh? I think we've all got an experience going, oh, I've got this logic that I've written over in this app, and now you need to share it to another app, and then it's only a short period of time until someone comes up to you and goes, can you read the commits from the other app and make sure that they're the same? And then this just goes round and round. So copy and paste is never really going to work in this situation unless it's a tiny bit of code reuse. Putting them in a folder is also not going to work for Angular very well. Angular needs a build tool to compile it. It has a whole build system around it. So I've seen people do this, but it never works out very well. Even just getting it from the TypeScript compilation and so forth. So if you stick it in just a folder that lives there, and it's outside of that build chain, either as a submodule or something, it's not the most robust method. It's not going to work so well. It seems easy at first, but you're probably worth spending a bit more time to do one of these other options. Different to those sorts of things about sharing like everything in terms of code is a tool called NSwag. So who's heard of Swagger here? Who's using Swagger to document their API? A fair few people, so maybe more than half. So Swagger is an awesome tool. And what you can do with Swagger when you document your backend, your API, when you've got all these DTOs and view models back there, you need those same things in TypeScript on the client side, because you're going to say, when I make my HTTP request to get this entity from my backend, I now need to have a TypeScript interface on my client side that describes the shape of that object coming down. So what we've used is a tool called NSwag. The first time I saw this, I thought this is never going to work well. We're going to auto-generate all of our kind of TypeScript interfaces for our Angular app. I'm not a fan of this idea, but we've done it in 5 different apps. It's worked every time. It's been brilliant. So I'm actually quite surprised how well it turns out. But that's only sharing the code to save you writing those interfaces. But it's quite good because as soon as you change your backend, all of your interfaces on your client side, you just run a little script and it updates all that. So that's quite a fantastic tool for code reuse, but it's a bit different type of code reuse than I'm kind of talking about here, but I thought I'd throw it in. So we have this core, and I want to try and get as much in there. So we've been using NPM packages, and I think this is probably the most robust version for being able to do this and what we've done a lot. But I also like this monorepo approach, which we'll talk about. Okay. But if you're going to do this, it's important to remember wherever you put this shared code, it needs to be angularized. It needs to have some sort of build chain for this to work well. So here in this case, I need to follow the Angular package format. It's actually a thing. You can go get the document and read it, and it will suggest for you. It's about 20 pages long. What are all the things you need to do as an Angular developer to make sure that the code or library you're writing for Angular, be it to be used on a mobile or web, is angularized? So you're going to need to go make a core.metadata.json file so that you can run AOT. So AOT is this ahead of time compilation so that you compile all of your Angular HTML templates, which have Angular-like syntax on them, like an ngIf, down to being executable code. You're going to need to have all your d.ts files, so you've got TypeScript definitions. You're going to need to have core.js, this flattened ECMAScript module, which has a great name of FESM. So if you load hundreds of modules into the browser, JavaScript modules, that can slow things down. So when you actually put it there, you want to bring them all back into one module, and that'll speed things up. And then you might want to have a UMD file. You might want to be Clojure compiler compatible so that in the future, if Clojure becomes another compiler Angular used to crush down the projects, then you're ready for that. I don't want to do any of this, honestly. I don't want to even look at this. I just want to write Angular code and have it work. And I bet you most of you are the same. So it's a bit too complex to roll your own one of these. You're going to need a library for it. So that's a bit of a takeaway from this. If you're going to write an Angular library, be it to share or just use in one app, you're going to need to follow these things. So there's a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different libraries I'll show you that you have choices on what you can do with that coming up. But before we do, I wanted to jump forward and talk about NgRx, because for us in this story of sharing code, NgRx has been a real key to it, not just for making our applications more robust and making them less buggy, but it's been really important because it helps suck kind of the logic out of your components and be able to put it in this shareable space. So who's heard of Redux here? Okay, who's using NgRx or Redux? Okay, so maybe a fifth of the room. Okay, so NgRx is the way that you do the Redux pattern for Angular. So Redux is a pattern. It's also a library from the React community. There's also a similar version in Vue. They've got Vuex, but in Angular we use this thing called NgRx. So it's much bigger than Angular, this redux thing. But if you want to implement that pattern in Angular, use NgRx. A little different in Angular because we use RxJS or reactive extensions for JavaScript, which is observables. If you're doing Angular, a lot of you will be aware of it. But this is kind of a bit of a twist on it. So it's really good, as I said, because it helps us suck this logic out of our components. And I'll show you some examples of that. So what's the best way to kind of share state in an Angular application at the moment if you're not going to use NgRx? So this would be best practice if you've got a smaller app and you don't want to use NgRx. You would follow this pattern of having like a container component, which is also some people call a smart component, and then a presentational component. And the container component would be the smart one, presentational component would be the dumb one. And then the way that you would share between these two or communicate is with these inputs or outputs. So the container component's the one that's going to have the injected dependencies. It's the one who knows how to route. It knows how to delete an entity, do all the work. But it doesn't really deal with rendering the HTML and actually showing the buttons and doing all the kind of the UI pieces. That would be the job of the presentational component. But what happens when you kind of get these nested presentational components and you're communicating between them with inputs and outputs, if you go too many deep, then you've got to communicate. You've got to pass it upper level, an event through this at output, and upper level and upper level. And then when you get another component that's way off in your component tree in Angular, then it's going to get harder to communicate. So what most people do as best practice, they go, well, let's make this a container component, let's inject the service, and we'll put this logic or state that I need between these two sections of my app, share it through a service. And this works great, but as your application starts to grow, you get more services and more components on the page, and these components are talking with these services and these services and these services. It gets very hard to know who updated which state in which service at what time, and you start getting race conditions and other challenges. So this is where using something like NgRx that uses Redux and has a store, a single place to put all that shared state, can really help. And this has been quite useful for sharing code across apps. So I want to just take a minute. Some of you would have seen this and get this and have clearly used it, but I'll just take a minute to do a lap through, like, what is the pattern, what is Redux, and what's that mean for us to be able to share code? So one of the main principles is this idea that you have a store. So your store is just a JavaScript object. It looks like this. Here you can see we've got companies and contacts, but it's literally just a JavaScript object. And when I want to get information out of the store, then I would, into a component, I would use what's called a selector. And that selector will be an observable, and if this component wanted to get the list of companies, it would select those companies out of the store, and then I have it in the component. And what I would normally do in a non-NgRx app, if I wanted to delete one of these companies, I would just, right there in the component, I would use I'd talk to an Angular service, it would talk to the API, delete the company, API would come back successfully to the service, talk to the component, and right there in the component, I'll do a bunch of work. I'd actually take that array of companies and delete it out, delete the one I want to get rid of, and then just update the UI. But that's not how you do it in an NgRx app. Now the component doesn't know how to do all that stuff, and that's good because we can start removing, making these more reusable. So the component, if it wants to delete a company now, would need to dispatch an action. And it's quite a specific term. And the actions look like this. They have a type and a payload. So the type here is delete company, and the payload would be the ID of the company. And who's listening for this event or this action that you've raised? Well, there's two spots. One of the spots would be reducers, and the other spot's going to be effects. And effects come from the library, the effects library from NgRx. And in our case here, we're making a HTTP request to delete this company. So if it was a synchronous amount of work that I need to do, and it was going to be, I could do it in a pure function, then I'd just go straight to the reducer. And a pure function being one that you call with the same arguments every time will give you the same result. But a HTTP request to a backend, you don't know what's going to happen. It's very asynchronous. It could be a 500. So in that case, you're going to go through the effect, talk with your Angular service. It'll go call you back and delete the company. If it's successful, it'll come back to the effect. The job of the effect is then to dispatch another action. In this case, it would be the delete company success and the ID of the company to delete. At this point, we are in a synchronous amount of the work we need to do is synchronous, and we can do it in a pure function, so we'll do it in the reducer. And we'll take this action, and the current state make new state for the companies, and that will update the store. So this one-way cycle of flow not only helps your applications be really robust, but it starts detaching this logic from the components in your application and makes it more shareable, which is kind of a side effect. The main benefit of NgRx and Redux is writing more scalable, less buggy code. So this is kind of what it looks like. For those who haven't seen it, you would just inject the store into a component, and then you might have something like this login function, and this component now doesn't know how to do anything, or it doesn't know how to delete companies. All it knows how to do is just say, hey, can you dispatch as an action to log in, or not delete, but in this case, log in. So it just goes, hey, I want to log in. Here's the payload, which has the username and password. Can somebody go do it? So this component's really simple now. It doesn't have to do all that work, doesn't really know much about anything. And the logic to do that work is easily shared elsewhere. So when I want to use this, all I have to do is inject the store into another component, and then I want to get this user, then I just use the store again to select, and I've got a custom selector here of get user that you could write, and then I have an observable of that user. So in this case, you can see how it really cleans up your components and makes things a lot simpler. I have a whole play-by-play on this. I think Lars is next door. You can go watch that if you want to see kind of, if you're new to Redux and NgRx, you can go watch it. So that's just a little introduction, because that's been a really big part for us. Like, we've spent a whole bunch of time getting upskilled with NgRx, and a big side benefit of that is being able to share code, because it all lives in this system of NgRx, and we can just use it, the whole thing, in another application. Okay. So moving on to talk about these two options, what are the options we have here? So the first one is NPM packages. I have a whole nother play-by-play on this. Someone asked me, am I going to do a live code demo? If you really want to watch a full live code demo, you can just go watch either of those, and there's lots in there about it. All right. So I want to be able to do this. I want to make an NPM package with all of my Angular services, all my Redux stuff, so that when I have my web app, I write all my stuff for my login, so you can dispatch an action to log in, it calls the service, logs them in, gets the token, all that sort of stuff. But when I write my mobile app, I just want to use the exact same logic again. So I can put all that in these services and this state management and go use that. So the way we've been doing it is changing. So this is how I've done it several times. I use this library here called Generator Angular 2 Library. So it's a community project. It's got 300 stars here on this picture. It's probably more, up to 1,000 now. It's a bit old, this picture. But this library is really good because you don't have to go do all that work that I showed you to kind of Angularize your shareable stuff. So the way it works, you install this Yeoman generator. You basically say, hey, yo, I want to make an Angular 2 library. And it will talk you through it. You say, here's my name and my email, the library name. I want to use Jest or Karma. Choose your testing framework. And boom, it makes you a separate repository that's just for this section of code that you want to share. And inside of here, you'll have all the bits. It kind of looks like an Angular app, but it's just one little part. And there's lots to it, but we're not going to go through all of it. But the bulk of it, you'll get, and this is similar for the other ones that I'll show you. You're going to get a whole bunch of sample stuff in there. You can see we've got a sample component, sample directive, pipe. But the interesting thing here is this index.ts file. So basically, you'll write some Angular code. It's going to feel just like writing normal Angular code, as I'll show you. And then in here, in this index.ts file or in this barrel, it's kind of like a public API of this set of code that you have. So there's lots in there, but these are the bits I want people to be able to see. So you'll document in your index.ts file and say, these are the bits that people can access from here. I'm going to export them out. And often that looks like this, just looks like an Angular module. So if you've done any Angular 2 or higher, you'll be very familiar with this. Angular modules are all over your application. It's the way you say, for this section of code, these are the things or dependencies for this area. So here you can see I'm going to export out of this module, this Angular module, and it feels just like bread and butter Angular, but we're in an NPM package. So this is the component that I want to share out, and this is a service that I want the consuming application to register for me. So I've got it in this for root method. So it's pretty simple. It doesn't feel too different to writing your Angular stuff, but the whole build chain's a bit of a pain in the butt, and I'll talk more about it. So when I want to use that, imagine there was, from here on, this is your job, the developer's job, to go write the bits that you want. I'm going to write the function that takes the username and password and logs in and so forth and do the work in the service. But when you have your consuming application, it feels very much just like using a third-party library. You basically just go, I've written my own sample module. It's inside my npm package. So I npm install my @sample-package, and then I can just go /core and pull out the sample module. And then I just have down here, I import it into the consuming applications Angular module, sample module.forRoot. So if you've written npm packages for Angular, this will feel very familiar, but if you've just worked in Angular, this will look like you're importing someone else's third-party library, except you wrote it. So how do you actually use this? And this is one of the challenges we've found with NPM that costs us time and costs the teams time, is you've got this thing called NPM link, because as a developer, you're sitting at your desk, you've got application 1 over here, application 2 over here, imagine you're in your machine, and then you've got your NPM package. They're all separate. You're on your device. You don't want to have to change one line of this shared code and then push it up into whatever's hosting this shared package, and then npm install it down into the other things just to see if it works, and then change one more line, and then have to do that same process again and again. So the way you get around it is you can do an npm link. So npm link comes from, if you've got Node installed, Node package manager, then all this will be sitting on your machine. So if you're at the path in the command line of the shared project that you've got, you can basically just say npm link, and then cd into the application that you want to share it with, and run npm link my -shared code, or whatever the name of your shared package is. And then it's kind of synced up. So if I make a change in one, as long as the build tool's running in my npm package on my machine, then I can instantly use it over in the consuming application on my machine. And that speeds things up. You don't have to leave your development environment to get it going. But I found this a real pain in the butt. It's kind of flaky. It's not necessarily the best way of doing things. It's not flawless. And it's one of the trickier parts. And this is even before you try and share it with another developer, because it's a completely separate environment, but it works. Okay. But then you get to the point you've got to npm install it. So what are you going to do there with your team? You've got a couple of different options. So you've written it, it's working, it's tested, you know it's doing its job, but now you need to kind of put it in production. So you could use a hosted package manager like npm and pay for it. That's a super simple option. They've got private hosted, so you can have a private npm package, and there's a robust ecosystem for it. You can use a private one like Verdaccio, and I've worked with a couple of companies who do this, so you host it yourself. So it's like hosting your own npm repository, and that works quite well as well. And for a lot of corporate clients, that's their only choice because they're not going to use npm. So they're both the most popular ones. You can do this hacky thing here that I'm showing you, but it will probably come back and just be a pain. So another really fast way of just being able to share it is you could actually just npm install it from a link. So you could put this in your package.json file and it will install this from whatever link your repository is at. But if this is private, then this becomes really painful really fast because you've got to have the password and so forth for this. And how do you get it into this kind of setup here? So it's not kind of very good, I find, to do this unless it's super easy or you're just getting going. But it is one option. So npm packages are great. I don't think I'm going to stand up here and say it's not what you should do. Like, there's definitely a huge place for them. It's the primary way of sharing code in the JavaScript world. But I've found for Angular, it can be quite painful for a couple of different reasons. But let's run through some of the positives. The really big positive, it's versioned. So you can have version 1 that one team's on and version 1.1, which the next team's on, and the two teams don't have to stay directly in sync. So that's a big deal for a lot of people. If you've got stable code, I love npm packages for that. If your code's not changing very much, that whole story of publishing it and then other people consuming it, and then if something needs to be changed quickly and quickly and quickly going through that same process, if it's something stable, let's say your company's written some widget like a menu bar and it hasn't changed in, I don't know, 3 months, then that's a great thing to put in an npm package because you're not going to have to go through that cycle all the time. But if it's like your core business logic that's always iterating, or you're at the beginning of a project, it's a real pain to go through that. So stable code's a great place for it. So it might start off in this monorepo situation I'll talk about and then move to an npm package. And also if it needs to be public. So if you have code that you have in a private repository, and you want to share it with someone else, that's going to be really difficult because I'm going to talk about just having a repository and not publishing it to NPM. So if it needs to be public, then an NPM package can be good for that. You can just share this single piece of shared stuff publicly and other stuff can be private. But some of the things I don't like about this approach that are painful as you start to do it is that it needs a lot more testing because you're writing this in isolation. You don't know when the downstream, when the application consumes your NPM package, if it's going to work. So you need to be better at testing it, and you can't throw junk over the fence because you don't know what happens when they install it. Whereas if you actually run it inside the same repository as I show you, then potentially there's some other benefits to not having to worry as much. It takes a fair bit of time to configure this approach. Not so much to configure it. I think once you're up and running, it's not so bad, but watching like several teams do this approach from scratch and they're not used to doing NPM packages, they'll usually, one developer is going to burn a week wrapping their head around it and kind of getting all the bits in place. And then the rest of the team can kind of watch and get up to speed. So it's not too expensive, but it definitely has a bit of a cost. You know, if you've got a 2-month turnaround, it's probably not the greatest option to do unless you're already used to making NPM packages. And AOT sucks. It just, yeah, this ahead of time compilation where you pre-compile your Angular templates. If you're working in this separate silo where you're making this NPM package, it's working great on your machine, and then all of a sudden you're doing lots of stuff in there, but you haven't run AOT in a while, because that's normally something people forget to run until they actually go to publish it. So you might have gone a day or 2 days and you haven't run AOT sort of build on it, and then it breaks because of AOT, and then you're like, oh, what did I do in the last 2 days that's now causing it to break? And some of that debugging experience has been more painful, you know, running these packages versus a normal Angular app and AOT. So for me, I just leave AOT on all the time when I'm making these shared packages. I just put the flag on the back of the build command. So this is all changing. Like I said, I'm going to share with you all the stuff that's changing in the community. So this is how I've been doing it. This is how a lot of people are doing it. That library is still really vibrant. But there's been another library for doing packages that's getting a lot of traction called NgPackager. And it's written by one of the people who are on the Angular team, which is pretty good credentials. And this is getting way more popular now, so much so that as of version 6 of the Angular CLI, now you can actually make a library right here in your project. So who's using Angular 6 in production? Okay, the hands went down. So last week, Angular 6 came out, and it hardly changes much of the code you write, but it's really cool, all the stuff that's coming for making our lives easier to build an application and to do libraries. So one of the things that they've released is this idea of being able to do more than one Angular application in an Angular CLI project. So you can make a projects folder or scaffold it out, and you could have 2 apps in there. So you could say, I'm going to have app 1 and app 2. But what's really cool now is you can use NgPackager, the other library for making NPM packages, and you can just scaffold it straight out in the same repository and the same tools that you're used to. So this has only just come out. You won't see great docs about it yet. You won't see many people using it yet, even though lots of people are using NgPackager. But this is going to become the default, I think, because we all just follow the CLI. It's so amazing, the Angular CLI. So if you wanted to do an NPM package, you'll find that this is likely the approach that you'll want to be looking into doing. So same things that I showed you before, but you'll use the CLI and you'll just say ng library, give it a name, and it'll put it in here, and the whole build tool around it will be in here, which is pretty cool. I think it's awesome. There's some pretty excited people out there about it. Okay, so that's for doing an NPM package. Totally nothing wrong with it, but I found this cycle kind of painful to go through using NPM packages because the code changes a lot, and the things I'm sharing are really day-to-day Angular code, services and so forth. So that's when we've started using NX monorepo. So the current project I'm on, we've got about 3 devs on it. It's not a massive project. We kicked off at the end of last year, and we started it as an NX monorepo. So the NX monorepo sounds like it's a whole new thing. It's not really that big a thing, and I'll tell you why. But basically, it's Narwhal extensions for Angular. So Narwhal is a company that have written these extensions, and that's all they are. But Narwhal are a pretty interesting group. They're a team of consultants. You can hire them here in North America. There are about more than a dozen of them now. And Victor and Jeff, who you can see in this picture, used to be on the Angular team. They wrote some of the things like the router and dependency injection, and they pride themselves on hiring consultants who are pretty badass. So that's their kind of niche. And of course, they used to write lots of libraries at Google, yeah? They wrote the framework and they had to share it with all of us. So when they left there and started doing enterprise consulting, they're like, well, we do libraries all the time and we work in Google's monorepo. We want the same thing for our enterprise clients because that's who they kind of focus on. So they went and wrote these narwhal extensions. And really, all narwhal extensions are is Angular schematics, which is a way of extending the CLI. So all it is an extension of the Angular CLI. It's not some massive thing, but it helps a lot in scaffolding applications. But it's very opinionated. You know, we think that you should build enterprise applications like this. So you get a lot of things out of the box in terms of linting and formatting, knowing what applications have changed, scaffolding out multiple applications. So we were like, look, we're not going to do NPM packages for sharing between our mobile and web app. We're going to use NX. And that's what we're going to stick all of our state management and our libs in. So if you're going to do NX, you'd end up in a position like this. So I've got a sample web in the orange, and I've got a sample mobile in the blue here, two separate applications. Not many people are doing this with mobile, I'll be honest. I'm kind of fringy and early in this space, but there's others, and I'll talk about that. But their main motto of the NX team, most of the people using NX are doing this just with multiple web applications, but we've been doing it with mobile. So imagine I have this sample web app in orange, and it might have its own libs, and this language is specific to NX. You got apps, which are applications, and libs, which are libraries. And you make an app, and then a bunch of libs, and then you pull those libs into the app to compose up your application. So here I might have a layout lib that's specific just for this sample web application. And then I might have some other libs that are specific just for this mobile application, like layout and something to do with photos for the camera on the phone. But then I might have a whole bunch of other libs that I want to share across both these applications. So I make more libs, and then those libs can be shared across both. So you end up namespacing them in folders in this similar sort of way. So if you want to make one of these, it's just an extension of the Angular CLI. You go npm install the Angular CLI on your machine, and then you install the narwhal schematics, and you're ready to go. So once you've installed the schematics, you just go create NX workspace and give it a name, and boom, it makes you something very similar to the Angular CLI. But the big difference is on an Angular CLI app, you'll just have one application on the root. I showed you that projects folder before with the stuff that's new for the CLI, where you had multiple apps and a library, but you've got to go and still do a bunch of stuff to make that happen, whereas here, that's their focus. So when you have both of these, the mobile app becomes a challenge, because that's what we're talking about today. And this was one of the first hurdles we hit in this is, well, where do we stick our mobile apps? Because they're not really they're an Angular app, but the build tool's different. And it actually doesn't share the package.json and all the other dependency of our web apps, because Ionic's really specific about how it builds. It needs to have this, node modules folder inside of this folder, and the build tools are at this file path. And we didn't want to go playing around with all that. So we just put the whole Ionic app and all of its build stuff and its node modules and everything straight in this mobile app folder here. So if you expose out this libs folder, you end up in a situation like this where you'll have like sample app 1 folder with the stuff that's just for sample app 1, a shared folder for all the things that are shared, and then a state folder for all the things that are state-based, NgRx state-based. So if you want to have all the authentication state, the core state, the search state, all of those things would put in here. So this is the approach we've gone down. If you're just writing two web applications with NX, you might not necessarily want to do that. But in our case, we wanted to separate the UI out from the NgRx parts. We wanted to say all of our state logic, we want to completely separate it from the HTML. So that way we can share it with the mobile and the web. But if you're doing this with just two web apps, you might put all that state stuff inside the shared thing. Okay. So this is actually our application at the moment. It's a little bit small there, but basically in our apps folder, we've got a foodzone-app and a foodzone-public app. So we've got a public website, and then we have a public app. It's still pretty small. We're only a few people, a few months, or probably 5 months in. And then down here we have our libs, and we've learnt to namespace these libs. At first we just stuck them all straight in this folder, and we ended up with 50 of them straight away, and it got a mess. So then we namespaced them back down. So we've got foodzone-admin-app So we've got an admin, like a heavy admin section, and then the rest of the app. And then we've got a shared section and a state folder. So that's kind of the approach. There's a bunch more in this I'm not showing you around some of these challenges, because even though this state thing we've kept agnostic from HTML and these shared components, it's been a little tricky, because when you're inside the middle of doing some work with NgRx, you'll often say, okay, great, I've deleted this user, and now I've updated my state, but now I want to stop a spinner, or I want to show a spinner. And that spinner is going to be a different spinner on mobile and web. So we've been using dependency injection quite heavily to inject, like at runtime, inject in those UI pieces into this section to share as well. If you're interested, come find me, I'll show you what we did. But there is a little bit more trickiness into it. But it's been much easier story than writing NPM packages, because all this code's churning all the time. You know, it's just that core stuff that you write. Okay, and then we've got our mobile app down underneath here. There's also other apps in here for databases and functions, and we've got an importer app, a bunch of other node apps. But when you're writing an application with NX, some people have been like, oh, it's a monorepo, I have to put everything, my back end in there, and all of my company's stuff, we're never going to be able to do it. But that's not the case. You could just use NX to do a single application. That story of breaking things out into libs, and then your application is just a shell that you put libs into, is a really nice story for Angular development. The architecture's great. So that can work quite well. Or you might have two of your applications in your company you want to put in a monorepo, but your other three aren't related, they don't share much code, so I won't put them in the same repo. It's all up to you as the developer how big these monorepos get. 2 weeks ago at NG friends of mine, Jeff and Nathan, released this tool called XPlat, which I think is really exciting, and it's also the first kind of thing I've seen anybody do in this space that I'm talking about with NX. So they love NX as well, and I remember we jumped on a phone call together when they were getting this started. But they really love NativeScript. I really love Ionic, but they've gone and made actually a tool that sits on top of NX, the community tool called XPlat, that allows you to run NativeScript, server-side rendering, a web app with all the best SEO strategies and everything. So rather than rolling your own of all these, if you're going to use NX and try and share code between mobile and web, if you're using NativeScript, I'd recommend checking this out because it looks amazing. But I'm not really stuck to Ionic, and I'm not really stuck, I haven't used NativeScript. But if I was starting a new project, if this got traction, I'd be very interested in having a look at it. It's very early days, like all of us developers, you know, you've got to do due diligence. There's a lot of the stuff we use burns out really quick, and you've got to protect yourself from that. But this looks really awesome. They've done an amazing job. It's worth checking out. Okay, so what are the things that I really love about a monorepo? I love how fast it is to get started. You just start like the Angular CLI and you're away. By default, everything's pulled out of the app. You're building it to share. It's really good. So sharing becomes much easier. You don't have this npm install, this npm linking, and all those sorts of things. We're still going to end up with npm packages, but most of it will be just directly shared through the repository. Shared dependencies is a positive and a negative in this space. If you've got everything in one monorepo for these Angular apps, and you're going to share code between them, you're sharing the same node modules and the same package.json and the same versions of everything. So depending on your team and the size of your company, that might be unrealistic. So I've worked with government teams in Australia where they've got 20 different teams. They're like, we could, but it's almost, I can't even imagine how we could all be on the same version. Our culture isn't that culture. We've had a life of government projects that are always at different versions of all these things. So for them, they wouldn't be able to do it. But for a lot of people, it is achievable. And a lot of big companies like Google and Facebook do that. So having every single app on the same version of TypeScript, you're committing to doing that. And your build process is going to cost you more time. Because when you build this npm package before, you just build this little thing, it's really quick, it just builds and you're done. It's not got much to build, but now you're going to build all of these apps, this mobile app, and potentially in our case, we're building some back-end stuff as well. And that takes us at the moment not too long, it's about 10 minutes for our build step, which is not too bad. We can live with that. But as we get more tests and more end-to-end tests, that'll probably go up to 20 minutes pretty quickly. And then we'll probably have to optimize. But we might get away with never having to actually start getting to the point where we go, what actually changed? And let's only rebuild the things that changed. But there is some stuff in NX which is pretty cool to go read through the commits and go, okay, great, we'll give you the tooling to know which apps are affected by these changes and which ones you need to rebuild. We haven't had to use them yet, but that's there. So that's kind of a pro and a con. In one way, it's easier for us because we've just got one build script. We just run the whole world every time. We build all of our stuff, every one, and I sleep a little better for that because if I broke something in this shared thing, it's not going to run when I run my tests in my actual consuming application at the exact same time, and I like that. I like that it's going to break. So that's kind of a pro and a con there, but as you get up, if you had 40 team members, you're going to have to probably have some custom sophisticated thing to know which things to rebuild because it will slow down too much. So where are we going to go to from here? What do I think is going to happen in this space? Well, I kind of already highlighted some of the things that I think we're going to see. I think, I'm fingers crossed, I'm hoping this is the year we see web components become day-to-day for us. I'd love to see the stencil components from the Ionic team become something that I can use in a web app. And I'd love to see Angular Elements that's in beta become something I can use in a mobile app. And then I'd love to use those components in something that's not even an Angular app. So at that point, I could probably start to share a lot more code in these applications because my table component that shows a list of users is going to be the same one in mobile and web. But we're not quite there yet. And even though it's probably going to come out for Ionic next month, it's probably going to be months after that until we're actually at a point where we're ready to use it, or it's not. It's actually going to be an RC or something else. It'll still be beta. So that's a bit of a ways off. The other thing I really think that's going to happen at the end of this year is I think NX caused this movement change. And now we're seeing the Angular CLI support libraries and multiple applications. But they're doing it slightly different. And they're not quite communicating yet because it's the beginning for both of them. They are communicating, but I think we're going to see lots of these tools, and we see XPlat come out that sits on top of NX. I think we're going to see all of this kind of gel to be a community one that we all use, like the CLI. And it's going to be like butter. It'll be much easier. You'll just go, give me a new project and another new project and a library, and I want it all to work. And I don't want to have to make all these decisions that we had to make. So I think that's where we'll be at the end of the year. But right now, it's kind of early days for all the things we're looking at and using. I'm going to be in NDC Oslo in June. I think it's probably the most fun conference I've ever been to. If you ever get a chance to go, we're going to run a 2-day workshop. I was just here running a 2-day workshop on NX and Angular and all the things I was talking about, except the mobile side. So if you're interested in coming along, come join us. So what have we talked about today? Well, we had a look at the new Angular, and that's not so new, but the Ionic stuff's changing a lot. We had a look at some good and bad code reuse options. We looked at how NgRx can really help, like pulling that code out of the components and making it more reusable. And we had a look at NPM packages and why that's a great option and why sometimes it's not a great option. And we looked at NX monorepos and that kind of movement that's coming into Angular and some of the benefits around it. So thank you very much, guys. I'll be around if anyone has any questions.
Test. Yeah, that's really good. Great. You want me to clip it or put it in my pocket or?
You can just put it in like the back pocket.
Okay.
There's an on-off switch on top.
Yeah.